How much of this stuff was speeded up, at least, by people like George Soros, people, sort of left-wing ideologues who believe in open borders and helping out, encouraging more refugees to come?
Huge amount. And I say this carefully because there are people who, as it were, go nuts on the Soros thing and attribute him to sort of like the modern Rothschild blaming. You know, I mean, there's an unpleasant tinge in the air sometimes around Soros. But if you look at what he and his NGOs did during the crisis of 2015, it was a wicked, wicked thing. And the fact that Viktor Orban in Hungary publicly named Soros, he got a huge amount of criticism for this, but he was right, I think. George Soros is meddling in Hungarian affairs, that the country's richest and most famous son should have been campaigning to I mean, there was a moment when there was exchange in which Viktor Orban blamed Soros, and Soros responded, yes, he is right to identify it, because, as Soros said in a statement, that Orban thinks the refugees are the problem and that the borders are the solution. We think differently. We think that the refugees are the solution and the borders are the problem. Soros's NGOs, and I've seen this on the front lines in the migrant camps, have been over the years helping migrants not just to come into Europe, but to lie when they get here about who they are. Yeah. They're taught via apps and via websites. You can see the websites. Many of them are still up. And by leaflets and other means, they are shown how to beat the system. Not that the system in Europe works very well at all. I mean, the whole system, as I show in the book, was defunct and broken by the time that the 2015 movement happened. But very quickly, this goes back to a point you raised earlier and I didn't actually answer, which is a very interesting and important point about where is different in Europe. And of course, one of the fundamental questions about the migration crisis of 2015 and the period before and since is, why has the East behaved differently?
Yes. Poland,
Slovakia, Hungary. Here's an interesting one. Viktor Orban, I think everyone would agree, is a right-wing leader. Neighbouring in Slovakia, Robert Fico is a left-wing leader. Now, the Prime Minister of Slovakia and the Prime Minister of Hungary agree absolutely on the migrants question and on the Islam and identity question, despite being right-wing in Hungary, left-wing in Slovakia. Why is this? This is a fascinating subject to me because there are very specific reasons, including the fact that the vast majority of the publics there are totally opposed to the mass migration and support their leaders in opposing it. But another reason I would submit, or another two reasons I submit, are firstly, that Eastern Europe remembers some of this better. That in the East, where armies in the past came in, remember this thing in particular. And a second reason is that they have something that Western Europeans have lost. I say in the book, if you were to boil it down to something, it would be that Eastern Europe still retains the tragic sense of life, and that Western Europeans have lost it utterly. We think we've got time off from history. We wish everything away on a tide of human progress. We pretend we don't die. We pretend that the point of life is to acquire more and more things and go on nice holidays. And Eastern Europeans have remembered you don't get time off from history, and that you may be swept away from one direction and then swept away from another, and you ought to be careful with your society.
Freedom isn't free, as the Americans would put it. You're listening to Delingpole, the podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Douglas Murray, author of many excellent books, the latest being The Strange Death of Europe.
But we should be recognising that instead of just calling people racist, we should be addressing why there is prejudice. That's not to say that everyone who's anti-immigration is racist, but it is to recognise that there is an element of racism and an element of prejudice within that anti-migrant feeling. And I think we need to be addressing that, trying to break down difference as opposed to reinforcing those differences, because people all over the world have far more in common than a lot of this discourse would have us believe.
You've written about the challenges, the cultural challenges. What would you say to Maya? What you've heard from Maya?
I entirely disagree. I think you would be hard-pushed to find a single country in the world that has been as tolerant and as welcoming of migration as this one. In fact, I cannot think of one anywhere in the world. I've travelled widely, not just on our continent, but across the world, and I can assure you that if the numbers that came into this country over the post-war period up to now had gone into any other country in the world, we would be seeing a very different response. And I think this is a knee-jerk assault on the British people, which is continuing and should stop. We were talking earlier about some of the economic implications. The economic implications of globalisation include the possibility that people born in this country, at the same time as somebody in this country has a child, they are competing with dozens of other children around the world to get to the lifestyle benefits that people across the world would dream of and which people in this country think is their birthright. And that's changing. And that's going to change across all sorts of parts of the developed world. And one of the things that makes that change far, far more painful is the idea that it will happen simultaneously with an assault on their identity. Because people can potentially take the stagnation of wages, they can potentially take the living standards questions, but if at the same time you say, oh, and by the way, maybe we don't always say you're racist, but we sort of imply it, then I think you're going to build up a lot of problems for the future. And by the way, very quickly on your 1970s point, one of the things about migration is it takes a long time for that effect to happen. If you look at the opinion polls on migration in this country that followed the influx after the Blair government, it took time for people's attitudes to, as it were, harden on migration, precisely because the impact of that migration takes the time to happen. So as well as it were, misrepresenting the facts, I think you just have to be extremely careful not to say, this country, which is, as I say, the most tolerant country in the world, is in fact the most bigoted, because if you travel anywhere around the world, you will see a very different picture.
I would just like, I think Douglas makes a very important point there. This point about tolerance is part, as far as I'm concerned, part of the problem. For decades, people have been told to put up with people, and there's never been a concerted explanation to demystify difference. So people have been told, put up with that person living down the street. They're different from you, they come from a different country, maybe they cook a different cuisine. Put up with them.
What if they have, can I ask you something? Because this comes to the heart of what so many people are debating at the moment, and it's actually at the heart of Douglas's book, and we'll get his response to it in a moment. What if they have a fundamentally different set of values, social values? Because we've come through, well, it's the 500th anniversary of the Reformation this year. We've had that, we've had the Enlightenment, we've had the Age of Reason. It's been a long road to where we are today for our, broadly speaking, liberal values. What if people are inimical to those? So firstly, we need to look at the fact that the history of Britain is one of my people coming in and out of the country. So this idea that values exist in this kind of hermetically sealed unit of the nation state quite clearly isn't true. If you look at David Olusoga's Black Britain, you'll see that over 2,000 years, people have been coming in and out of this country, contributing ideas and to social change. And what I would like to be answered on this question of social values, what are the social values? What are the social values that we feel are at risk by migration? Let's pinpoint them particularly because this is consistently talked about in the right, and it's never quite clear.
I can do. Firstly, on your point about the constant movement, actually, the movement into these islands in particular has been really minimal over, what was the biggest event over the last millennia? The Norman Conquest. About a 5% population shift as a cause of the Norman Conquest. So this idea that, as it were, the movement has been perennial. Also, the movement that you're talking about most of the time is movement from France with the Huguenots, for instance, Protestant French people, or movement from Ireland into what we now call mainland Britain. That is not the same as somebody from Eritrea or Ghana or Myanmar moving in to live in Salford. It's a totally different movement, and you should admit that.
What's so different about people from Eritrea, Myanmar, and
my God,
please
you
tell me
can't have gone anywhere.
Specifically,
you can't have gone anywhere. If you honestly have to ask that question, it is a simple statement
of the
simple statement of the obvious that countries and cultures have differences.
What
it doesn't mean
specifically what are the cultural specificities?
Okay, I'll give you the history lesson. This country has, throughout most of its history, been for instance, a Christian country. It has been, I'm not a practicing Christian myself, but it has been historically a Christian country. It's been particularly a Protestant Christian country. With views, if I may just finish, you see, you ask me to define something, and then I try, and then you talk. You have institutions. You have institutions that, for instance, epitomise the country. In this country, the institutions that epitomised our country were an established monarchy, for instance, the establishment of Parliament, the establishment of the judiciary and of the law courts. the establishments of the great educational institutions. A whole set, I could go on and on. Now, see, one of the problems is, whenever people say, well, what is this thing that you call Britain? We have an identity. It's forever being put on the psychiatrist's couch now and being deconstructed. But we have an identity just as other people have an identity. We don't have to war or hate each other, but we should recognise it exists.
OK, Myra, we'll come back to you. Just hold.
The change has been so radical and rapid.
Well, we can't ignore that. And to come back to Douglas's point originally, which I think we need to probe more, is this idea that...
Probe away.
Is that this idea that British society, he listed the monarchy, he listed Parliament, that is somehow under threat from people from Eritrea, Ghana and Myanmar. That's not clear to me how that's the case. You've listed all these institutions, but you haven't really explained exactly what it is that is under threat from these people. From
A quick answer from Douglas, but he has to answer that because he's had a direct... He's had a direct challenge there, and then Sam, I'm going to come to, and Linda, I'm going to go Linda first, then Sam, but Douglas, answer that direct challenge from Maya.
You can do it on all sorts of things. You can do it on historical attitudes, or you can do it on, for instance, current social attitudes, which is, I'll throw out as one example. And take an example that Nikki just cited of tolerance. I think we agree in Britain that we're a tolerant country, we're meant to be a tolerant country, we try to be a tolerant country, and so on. There's been polling in recent years that actually shows that the more immigration you have, the less tolerance you have on certain issues, not because we, the British people, have become intolerant, but because people come with views of their own. Let me give you a very quick example. A poll carried out 2 years ago by YouGov asked people their opinions on homosexuality, morally acceptable or morally not acceptable. Across the country as a whole, about 14% of the British people said homosexuality not morally acceptable. In London, it was double that. Why would that be? Is it because London, the capital city, is just a particular home of homophobia? Or might it be, as I would suggest it is, because people come into the country with attitudes of their own? And you may deprecate that, and I deprecate that, but we should at least acknowledge it, and you're trying to cover it over.
No, I think that actually, this poll, what's actually, there's another poll that shows actually, and asks about attitudes towards homosexuality and same-sex marriage, and you actually find, apart from Scotland, in one of the questions, London has better attitudes towards homosexuality than the rest of the country, than other regions in the country.
They could be evangelical Christian, they could be certain Muslim communities. You know that attitudes are harder on that. That is
but the point, my point is that Douglas is citing this poll, but there's counter-evidence to that. And I just want to make a broader point that, yes, there are some attitudes that I don't agree with, such as homophobia. I think that we should be challenging those, because if you go back to the late 1980s, even Margaret Thatcher was saying that our children were being taught traditional moral values, were also being taught that they had an inalienable right to be gay. And that led to the Section 28. So the point is, social attitudes do change, and you should be encouraging other people to change.
Wait a minute, OK. People won't like Douglas.
The other thing is, just quickly, that the corporations and things, they're not entities that are impossible to affect. And I was speaking to somebody from Silicon Valley recently, one of the big tech firms there, who's saying, you know, the way in which they've developed politically, for instance, I mean, these are corporations with more money than a lot of countries, but the way they've developed in their idea of politics is sort of teenage. I mean, they say they've grown so fast that, you know, their sort of hands have gone a bit faster than they...
In particular, has been taking in a lot of immigrants and refugees, and I don't know if you can answer this, but like, why do you think Sweden is taking in more immigrants than like Norway and Denmark? Like the other two countries, like the latter two, they've tried to cap it because they don't want to like disrupt their population, whatever. But Sweden continues to take it in, even though there's a lot of people on the right side, a lot of nationalists, not even nationalists, just people in general just don't want to take any more immigrants. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I spent quite a lot of time in Sweden for this book, and for some years, and as in the rest of Scandinavia, and there's a very, very interesting set of reasons. The specific reasons for why Sweden has been the only country other than Germany to take in this percentage of refugees is all sorts of things. But one, I think, is the self-image of the country. I thought when I first started going to Sweden that Sweden didn't suffer as much from the guilt thing as the rest of Europe. And then I realized it's a very subtle form of it that actually has been growing since you go away from the war, as Swedes have become more aware of what they didn't do and what they did, which I think they're going through a very interesting rethinking of what actually happened in those years that they don't feel good about. And that's one reason why they carry the guilt. As for the comparison with the other countries nearby, it's a fascinating question. I have one main thought on it. Denmark is one of the countries that got what I describe as an early warning siren going off. Because in 2005, when one very small Danish paper ran a set of cartoons on Mohammed, the whole world went nuts, and embassies were burned, and mum was killed in Africa, and there was, I mean, you know, demonstrations on the streets of London with people waving placards outside the embassy saying, "Behead the people who offend Islam." It went all around the world, and the Danish government at the time, I think, learnt a lot from it, and I think that the Danish people learned a lot from it. And I once spoke to a Danish politician some years ago, but some years after the crisis, the cartoon crisis. I always say you've got to say the cartoon crisis with a straight face. It's talks about the mad, strange era we're in. But I spoke to a Danish politician who said to me, "I don't want any more immigrants in the country now." And I said to them, "Well, that seems an excessively bald cut-off." And they said to me, "Look, for every we've done polling on it, and the polls all show that 90% of Muslims in Denmark think that the Danish papers don't have the right to publish cartoons of Muhammad or ever blaspheme Islam." This MP said to me, "Look, I don't want to do it, because for every 10 people we bring in, 9 of them will stifle our right to free speech more, and so we don't want it." And I thought that, look, you can agree or disagree with that, but it's a plausible viewpoint. I think that Denmark, for that reason, saw what was happening in 2015 and dodged the whole thing. And it dodged it, by the way, in a very interesting and unpleasant way. At one point during this book, I spoke to a French official, and I said, "How come you dodged a lot of the 2015 thing?" And this French official said to me, "There's some advantages to being regarded as a racist country." And that's a very interesting response. Now, Denmark went out of its way to look unwelcoming when they did this thing that they've done very few times, actually, as far as I understand, but announced that migrants coming across its border could have their valuables to the value that they might take from the state in welfare have taken away from them at the border. There was a huge hue and cry across Europe and across the world. People made Holocaust comparisons, I think unjustified, but they made all sorts of historical comparisons. My God, you're taking refugees, jewelry off them, and so on. Actually, I think very little of this happened. What it did do was it sent this very strong and ugly message around the world. Denmark doesn't want you. Don't come here. So that's what happens when you have a crisis of leadership and you have a crisis of things happening, and people all have to come up with a way to deal with it. And some of them do it well, and a lot of them just make it up as they go along. And some people will come out of it well, and some come out of it badly. But it's a fascinating